3.
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. We're really excited to have you join our Fireside Chat today, which is part of a Health Tech Build series where our purpose is to share expert insights on compelling topics in a brief half-hour format that we hope you enjoy. Today, I'd love to welcome Kathleen Somera Molina and Holly Schmidt, and they will be talking about real-world evidence and their perspectives in terms of where we are now and where we're heading. I'm Jen Sato. I'm co-founder and a board member of Health Tech Build. And before we start the discussion, I wanted to take just a moment to highlight what Health Tech Build is about. We're a mission-driven nonprofit focused on accelerating digital technology within healthcare and life sciences. And we host many events to give opportunities for sectors to collaborate. We've been fortunate to have many leading organizations participate. If you think you might be interested in partnering with us, we would love to hear from you. Check out our website, healthtechbuild.com, and you can reach out directly to us through the website. I'd like to thank our sponsor, MediCuity, and also again, welcome our speakers. Kathleen is Global Medical Affairs Head for Spinal Muscular Atrophy at Biogen. Prior to Biogen, she was Global Medical Director Lead for Rare Blood Disorder, PNH, at Alexion, and Global Medical Director Lead for the MS and Neurology franchise at Sanofi Genzyme. She trained in neuroscience, drug discovery, and clinical investigation at Northwestern University, where she focused on neurological disorders. Kathleen has a BS in biochemistry and microbiology from University of Florida, and an MS in clinical investigation and PhD in integrated life sciences with a focus on neuroscience from Northwestern University. Holly is VP of Scientific Operations with Accelerated Cure Project for MS. She co-chairs the research committee of I Conquer MS, a virtual participatory research network for MS. She founded and leads the MS Minority Research Engagement Partnership Network and has provided direction to ACP's MS repository, which provides biospecimens to scientists worldwide. Prior to Accelerated Cure Project, she co-founded a management consulting firm and 2 software companies. Holly has an MS in management and BS and MS in materials science and engineering from MIT. She's active in MIT alumni efforts, serves on the IRB of Beth Israel Deaconess, is a board member for the International FOP Association, and secretary for the Multiple Sclerosis Coalition. So again, thank you both for joining us. We're really excited to listen in. And so with that, I will go ahead and transition over to Holly.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Jen. It's a pleasure to be here with Kathleen discussing how real-world evidence can make a positive difference for individuals and society. As mentioned, I work for an organization focusing on accelerating new breakthroughs for people with MS. I'm also on the board of a nonprofit supporting research into a rare disease called FOP. Both of these organizations have invested in generating real-world evidence, namely registries and data sets documenting natural history, treatments, and outcomes for these diseases. We'd like to clearly understand what the value of this evidence is for supporting drug development and other forms of innovation. So Kathleen, I'm really excited to hear what you have to say on this topic. Could you please start by sharing a bit about your background and how it relates to real-world evidence? And then could you explain for those who are new to this topic what this type of evidence is, what it's used for, and why it's important?
Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jen, for the invitation to be part of this Fireside Chat with Health Tech Build. And thank you, Holly, for being here with you. It's such a pleasure to have this discussion. So my role at Biogen as the head of SMA Global Medical Affairs is to be the charge for the vision, the strategy, and the tactics for our global medical affairs teams in spinal muscular atrophy, where we have an approved product called Spinraza, as well as products in the pipeline And essentially, it's divided into two parts. That is my key focus of my role, which is life cycle management, and then the traditional global medical affairs activities of key expert engagements, as well as medical education. So in today, I will share my perspectives and insights, of my own experience, but they don't necessarily reflect the perspective and insights of my company. And my role, though, at Biogen is very focused on real world evidence as well, because once a product is approved, our medical teams continue to understand that product's safety and effectiveness profile in the real world setting. And that's the part of the life cycle management focus part of my group. And I have a medical director that's in charge of that. And I lead a team of medical directors primarily focused on understanding our drugs after it's approved. For your first question, Holly, you asked me what is real world evidence. I think before we can go and dig deep on real world evidence, I think we need to better understand where, what do we mean by that, and what information is it composed of, and we need to understand real world data. And from the FDA, they define real world data as data that's about the healthcare or health status of a patient, or the delivery of healthcare in the routine setting that is then collected in it's in the various sources of data that we have, including electronic health records, or EHRs, for example. Those are clinical data that doctors collect. You probably have heard of patient generated data. So patients answering questions on forms. So patient reported outcomes. We have various apps now that collect those remotely for patients. That's useful, I think, in this COVID time, because maybe patients want to answer questions and not necessarily go to the clinic, for example. We also have data that's medical and pharmacy benefits. So through understanding the cost of care and utilization. So claims databases, for example. And I think everybody's familiar with public health data as well. So all of those data, once it's aggregated and transformed to meaningful data and clinical evidence, becomes real world evidence, which is very, very important because it's in the setting of daily life. It's in the real life setting where patients are living their everyday life and HCPs are making decisions. So I think it gives us this holistic view of how a treatment may be working outside your traditional randomized clinical trial.
Great, thank you for that. Could you talk a bit about how the role of real-world evidence has changed over time, and how it's used compared with traditional data that's used in regulatory decisions, and maybe also provide some examples of when the role of real-world evidence has resulted in a decision or an approval or some other positive change?
Thanks for that question, Holly. It actually brings me back to when I was in graduate school, this question, because when I was in graduate school in the clinical investigation program at Northwestern University, we had experts from Abbott, come in to give talks about the pathway from drug discovery to drug approval. And I remember I wasn't hearing anything about real world evidence, at that time. And this is the early 2000s. So I'm not going to date myself, but I just thinking about it, even in my epidemiology and also in the biostats class, when it comes to, I think, drug approval and the regulatory bodies embracing it, it wasn't a big topic, back then. But fast forward, as I've been in industry, it's become increasingly a very, very important topic. And I think it's a very important topic in a sense that there's cost considerations, timing to availability of a therapy, especially for diseases that are rare, diseases that are fatal, for example. You want to accelerate that time. So there's that key consideration, but there's also competitive pressures. So as a treatment landscape for disease changes so that there are more options, there's more competition. And so companies want to differentiate their product. And so try to find ways in order to do that. So that said, I think there's been changes on their use of real world evidence in the extent that companies leverage it for their objectives. So there are multiple ways to do that that I've seen companies do, which is to utilize real world evidence in designing clinical trials, designing randomized clinical trials for products in the pipeline. So I've been part of projects where we go into patient and disease registries to understand which population might respond well in for the product that's in development, but also understanding specific patient population profile and endpoints and outcomes that might be utilized that's appropriate for a specific product. For example, real world evidence has also informed clinical guidelines and the standard of care for patients in a specific disease. Traditionally, the regulatory agencies sometimes require post-approval support of that data. So that's typically done through either a registry, or additional studies that are based on real world data and real world evidence. So there are multiple ways I think that companies leverage real world evidence, and slowly it's increasingly the extent at which companies leveraged it has really increased over the years. When it comes to regulatory bodies, though, I think they've also progressed in the sense that they have shown signals of accepting real world evidence into regulatory submissions. And when I went to research this and read about it, one example, and a very good one, I think, is the cancer drug Blincyto from Amgen, where it was granted accelerated approval, and it was based on the use of historical controls data from patients who had been treated with standard of care. And there was a weighted analysis of patient level data from medical charts that was used as historical controls to then compare that to Blincyto, and that helped it get accelerated approval so that patients could then could available for patients, right? So that's one example for real world evidence use. In that case, that is historical control. But another example is a product by Janssen that was also then the expansion of their label for schizophrenia, and that drug is paliperidine. And for that one, real world evidence was used to support inclusion into the label used in high risk patients, and that expanded their label, already an existing label. So that's another way where the regulatory bodies such as the FDA has signaled embracing real world evidence. And I think these are very good examples for our society as well, because it can take a long time to do the clinical trial, the randomized clinical trial. And just imagine how long it would have taken to wait for those studies to happen if real world evidence wasn't there.
Yeah, thank you. Those are great examples. Very exciting about the potential and things that real world evidence is already achieving. Could you now talk about the other side? Working with data myself, I know that real world evidence is real world evidence. It's not perfect. It's not pristine. Can you talk about the current shortcomings in real world evidence that are potentially preventing it from making the impact it could be having?
Right. That's a very good question. I think we can start by maybe contrasting the randomized clinical trial and then real world evidence, data. In randomized clinical trials, or RCTs, we have a controlled environment in which we perform the clinical trial. That's why we have protocols to ensure that just the right patients that meet the inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria get into the study, so it's as clean and as pure as possible, homogeneous patient population, so that the signal that we see in terms of the efficacy of the drug is exactly as we see it, and it's not based on chance, or there's no bias or errors that are introduced. So it's very controlled environment. But in the real world setting, we have a lot of factors that could be introduced, even as simple as the comorbidity of a patient, right? So we tend to exclude those in the randomized clinical trial. So there are factors that the almost the value of this real world setting, and it also then could bias or could introduce a confounder, for the data that we're looking for. So that's we need analytic tools, biostatistical methods to make sure that we adjust for those. And I'm not a biostatistical expert, but I know that I have colleagues that are working on figuring out novel methodologies and tools to ensure that they can control for those from a statistical point of view, which is one of the limitations. But it's also the value of being in a real clinical setting is that you have a diverse patient population,
Mm.
so you can actually understand what actually happens versus what should happen or you expect to happen in a controlled environment. I think I think the right now in terms of technology, we have tons of advances in technology, as you know, and that's utilized to collect real world data from patients. So things like prescribed digital therapeutics, they're able to collect real world data as patients use those their devices. And there's tons of data, so it could be overwhelming. So what do we do with all of those data, and can we make sense of data and connect the dots, just as like a doctor that's seeing an x-ray and or an MRI, and then make the conclusion that, okay, maybe this patient needs this treatment. How do we make sense of it all so that it's meaningful for patients, and also not only for HCPs but also patients, right? It's meaningful for them. And there I think we need advanced analytics
Mm.
to take care of that data. We can no longer just depend on traditional analytics for real world evidence, which are in that example that I gave for using the historical control. It is based on matching patients that have similar characteristics and so on, whereas the advanced analytics really makes sense of all of these information coming from different sources and synthesizes information across different sources to make sense of it. And that's where I think machine learning and artificial intelligence and machine learning will come into play, that will then create these predictive models, which could really help treatment decision making by physician, but then also eventually patients and caregivers.
Right. Thank you. That's really interesting. It seems like kind of the one of the advantages of real world evidence being that is more inclusive. You can bring in a lot more data. Is kind of one of its disadvantages as well. But hopefully the analytical tools can help adjust for that. And I would think also there's a difference between real world evidence and your typical randomized clinical trial evidence is that the data is not collected at the exact same times. You don't have the same cadence, so you might have missing data as well, from patient to patient. So I would think that those tools could also help to make up for those shortcomings as well.
Yes, Holly, I think that's a really great addition in a sense, because you're talking about data capture, and real world evidence is really based on what data is available out there, right? Because like you said, there could be a reason why the patient did not provide specific data for a registry, for example, and they missed their appointment. I mean, you'll have those to deal with real world evidence. And so that actually brings me to just reminds me that it's an important point that we do, just as we're doing now, that we educate patients, their caregivers on the importance of real world evidence as well, so that the data that is collected is as complete as possible, and that they also understand, why is it important that they're receiving this data, and why is it important that it's as complete as possible. It's because in the end, it will help us with approval, it will of a drug, it will help us with designing a clinical trial, it will help inform HCPs in their treatment decision making, and so on and so forth. So I think having this awareness overall, not just us today, HCPs, but also the patients and caregivers.
Yeah, I'm going to have to contact you offline to get you to write our next email to
Oh,
our network to remind them, why is it important to fill out your surveys? And people will say, well, nothing has changed. My condition is exactly the same, so I don't think you need to hear about me. But no, we actually really do need to hear about that because that's telling us, something is working for you. And we'd like to know what that is and relate that to whatever factors might be involved. And then it also gives us a more robust data set to share with Kathleen or others who are trying to make a difference in this disease. Um, could you explain? You mentioned a little bit about new digital health solutions that might be producing new types of real-world evidence. Could you talk a little bit more about what's coming forward? What new types of data will be brought into play that can make an impact in R&D and other areas?
yes, I think there's already great examples out there. I know, Holly, you work in MS, and I've worked in MS before as well. There are apps and platforms out there for MS where they're collecting, and they're supported by companies in partnership with the patient advocacy groups, where the companies are um, collecting real world data from patients who are treated, untreated, it doesn't matter, um, and utilizing that information to design trials, ask additional research questions. I didn't even mention it here, but it could also help inform reimbursement, of therapies. So payers are always interested in terms of, yes, you've shown the efficacy in this clinical trial, but how about in the real world in different types of patients, for example. So I think there are, MS is such a great example of that, where there are already applications that are trying to capture this data from patients through their iPhone, for example, so that they can enter from day to day. In the rare disease, so for example, in spinal muscular atrophy world, I think that's something that we have to tap on. I think this remote collection of real world data, this use of the app, potential could be, there could also be remote assessments. I think this COVID situation that we are in, I mentioned earlier, patients may not want to go to the clinic as much as before, and they have reservations for that, or maybe there's the travel, to the clinic. So could we collect that information, remotely? There are also already technology in terms of wearables, and then that's data that could also be included in real world evidence. So in MS, since I worked in MS before, there were accelerators, um, devices that really measure your mobility, for example. I think those offer us the richness of data that we are able to get a glimpse of what patients are doing in their daily life. Um, I think, and that's the technology. I think you talked about data completeness before. I think that's always a challenge in registries. If there's a way for technology to address data completeness, that's a big area, right? To solve, like you said, how do we motivate the patients to share their data? But then when they do, how do we capture them in such a way that is simple? And some registries are complex. They
Mm.
collect a lot of information, and then is there a platform where you could collect that information, simplify it? I don't have the answer to that one, but if there are companies thinking about ways they could contribute. I think that's one area is improving registries, the technology to capture that data. I think some of it is actually probably old because I've worked on registries where the platform is very old.
Mm.
Is one just like some of the ideas that come to mind.
Yeah, I think the point that you made about capturing data in a person's daily lives is really important, because when you're only capturing it at a clinic visit, you're just seeing what is going on with that person on that day, and you can ask them, well, how were you a month ago or a week ago, but it can be hard to recall that. So to have that richness of data from something that's kind of on constantly can be really important. And especially when it's something that is low burden to the participants, which you mentioned as well. Nobody wants to do something that's tedious or complex or intrusive. The lower the barrier to entry or the activation energy, the better. And if something can be passive, totally passive, and collecting data in the background, all the time, so much the better. We're talking with companies that have those types of technologies that capture things off the cell phone, and can give a readout without the person having to do anything, which is really exciting. The question is, how do you evaluate that information, because it's usually novel types of information, so you try to tie it to something that people are already used to, the types of outcomes that people are comfortable with, so they know how to interpret the information. And that's true whether it's a clinician or a regulatory body or a company or whatever. So I think that's another thing we need to be working on.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think these digital health solutions, we can collect all of this data, but in the end, it has to make sense. It has to be meaningful for patients and the stakeholders that it'll serve. And that's also a comment that we get all the time from the providers, that we, because they hear about digital solutions and real world data all the time, and say, well, it has to make sense, it has to be meaningful for me and my patient. And actually that brings me to a very important point. In order for real world evidence to move forward, I think that the healthcare providers, the doctors, the
Mm.
nurses, have to be able to trust the data that they are presented with. Because right now, I think, yes, the RCT, or the randomized clinical trials, remain the gold standard, right? But there are challenges to that. I mentioned them: cost, and then also time. So more and more, they have to kind of move towards trusting the real world evidence, but they're also right to question it to make sure that it's high quality data. And so the solution there then is really having these methodological innovations to ensure that it's high quality, and maybe it could contain elements of an RCT in these real world evidence, some elements, because it can't meet all of them, to have these data so that the healthcare providers can also trust this real world evidence, and they'll be more open to those type of data to support therapies and devices and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we've got only just a few minutes left. I wanted to kind of ask you to sort of sum up. And because I work for a patient advocacy organization, I always like to understand how innovation can benefit individuals and their communities. So could you just, maybe share a few last thoughts about why should society care about real world evidence? Why is it important for people with health conditions and their caregivers? And then if you see any specific value of real world evidence when it comes to people with rare diseases too, that would be wonderful to hear. Any final thoughts you have on these topics?
Yeah, thank you so much. So the FDA actually has an initiative. It's a 21st Century Cures Act and PDUFA, where they are asked to accelerate drug development by incorporating patient perspectives into this, and that would include real world evidence, right? To essentially make the path from drug discovery to a therapy available in society for treatment of patients. So that to me is very important, because the patient, perspective to include it. So the real world evidence is the opportunity for patients to actually be listened to, and to provide information. So that's why it's very important, because they're also the patients are also the end receiver of the benefits of treatments. And so I think that's why it's very, very important. We're given an opportunity, the regulatory bodies want to listen, to patients. And in the end, the patients are the user. So I think that's really very important to point out. I think for real world diseases, we can only do so many clinical trials, right? I think I talked about the time, I talked about the cost, the urgency. I think for parents who have children or family members with rare diseases, time is of the essence to them. We can't move too fast, right? And so I think for them, it's really important to leverage a real world evidence to help move treatment forward, so the patients could benefit. But the other part is, from just a drug development point of view, you only have so many patients to do clinical trials on. And maybe for the first treatment, you have those patients, because then you can have randomized clinical trials to placebo and to treatment. But when new therapies come about in the rare diseases, and now you have to start out with treatment naive patients, you're not going to have that, because everybody will want to be on that first treatment that is approved. So the drug development for additional treatment, is maybe slower if you just depend on randomized clinical trials. So I think that's another way to think about it, is that how do you then leverage real world evidence to continue to advance the science, like in rare diseases, even when there are treatments that are available, there might still be continuing or unmet medical needs, and you need to do that research. So that's a huge opportunity, and that's something that uh, I'm involved with in a daily basis in my role. So I will leave it with that.
Well, thank you so much. I think we're at time, so we'll bring this to a close. Thank you so much, Kathleen, for your perspectives. To our audience, I hope you enjoyed this chat. There will be a number of other events coming up in the new year, so please go to the Health Tech Build website for information. And thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Holly.